Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hope you had a good weekend. Yeah, we're getting near the end of the semester. We got about 3 weeks left. At least 3 weeks of classes left. Anyway, I am not done with your papers, but I'm about halfway done with the papers, which is not nothing. It's not everything either, unfortunately, but it's not nothing. I'm trying to work through them bit by bit. They should be coming available to you as soon as they get done. I'm working backwards in the alphabet, so if your if your last name is near the end of the alphabet, you might have already gotten your paper back. If you're at the beginning, it might take a little bit longer. I will hopefully get all of them done by the weekend at the latest. I'm hoping even before that, but hopefully the weekend will be the absolute latest it takes me to get everything done. And then next week, I'll hand out the final paper draft. The rubric for the final paper, which will be during the final exam period. There's not any final or anything in here, so we won't meet during the finals week, unless anyone just wants to talk about their paper or anything. But you'll have to turn in the final paper during the final exam period. So that'll be the last big assignment. Yeah, so any just business questions? Any questions about any of that before we begin? All right, good. Then let's get started with Al-Farabi, because I love Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi is crazy. My hope is that by the end of today, you will all be flabbergasted and want to rewrite all of your papers, whether to agree with him or argue against him. Because indeed, he gives us an amazingly clear definition of religion. There's no ambiguity about what he thinks religion is. Indeed, I actually encourage all of you to write your final draft in the same way Al-Farabi wrote. He is unbelievably clear. He is unbelievably bold. There's no, oh, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Nope, he's going to tell you exactly what he thinks religion is. And what is religion? Let's go to the punchline. What is religion? Religion is philosophy dumbed down for the average person. That's what religion is. It is dumbed down philosophy. Turns out Plato was right. Or not Plato, sorry. Turns out Nietzsche was right, and Christianity just is Platonism for the people. Al-Farabi's like, yep, exactly so. So Al-Farabi's writing in Islamic context, but yeah, he's saying, yeah, you know what Muhammad was, really? Muhammad was a true philosopher king. He was such a good philosopher, he was able to express it in a way all of you morons could understand. And that is religion. That is religion. Right? And also, indeed, it is the same thing as the rulership of the state. Religion and statesmanship are effectively the same thing. They're effectively the same activity as well. So my hope is you were all flabbergasted to start with. You were all, and again, Islamic theologian. That is what Al-Farabi is doing, right? So my hope is you were all flabbergasted, first of all, stunned, shocked. There's no sense in which God is part of the definition of religion or anything transcendent. It plays no role. It plays a role in what he's going to call virtuous religion, but not in religion proper. And indeed, this fits in nicely. Al-Farabi himself is probably not an orthodox Islamic thinker. Probably not a great surprise to any of you. But he's actually not that far from orthodox. The part of it that's not orthodox is the philosophy part. The understanding of religion is functionally identical with statesmanship, and religion not fundamentally requiring belief in God or anything of the sort. That is actually going to be orthodox. We're going to next read a very orthodox person. We're going to read Al-Ghazali, who's probably, besides Muhammad himself, the most important thinker in Islam. But he's going to say basically the same thing about the relationship between statesmanship and religion. That religion and statesmanship are one and the same. So yeah, I mean, the basic Islamic sense from people that I've talked to and from what I can tell is that secularism is a religion. It's in particular a particularly bad form of Protestant Christianity. And so to say that the Islamic world should adopt things like the separation of church and state, that the Islamic world should become more secular, is just to say the Islamic world should stop being Islamic and should become bad versions of Protestants. And so indeed, we have someone who is being as clear as can be. Yeah, and someone in the chat is commenting that they really like this interpretation of Al-Farabi's interpretation of religion. They're on board with the religion being dumbed down philosophy. Well, you know who else probably it was? Plato. I think Al-Farabi is probably doing a pretty good job of actually articulating Plato's personal view. Plato never actually really talks about religion as such very much. He talks about gods and that kind of thing all the time, but he doesn't talk about religion itself in any normal sense. The only time it ever comes up is when there's some concrete political question, like what kind of festivals should we have? And he's like, oh, I don't know, we'll send a delegation to the Oracle and have the Oracle tell us, because it doesn't matter. Not important. The important thing is the philosophy part. So, yeah, my hope is you're going to find all of that you found this reading interesting, and that it is triggering exciting directions for the final draft. Because really, so far, we've really only looked at one definition of religion. We've only really looked at Taylor's, that religion is human happiness in some sense, being built in to the foundation of something transcendent. Now we're going to get another one from these Islamic thinkers. We're going to get a different one. Someone's asking that, or raising this question of whether or not Islam is actually even properly characterized as a religion at all. There's a couple of different words in Arabic that you can use. None of them really neatly translate onto the English word religion. So you're quite right to point that out. The word din, which is something like way of life, isn't really the word that we would use for religion in Islam. The word is, I'll write this up a little bit later, mila. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. My Arabic, I know a little bit of Arabic, but very little. Right. This is the word that usually gets translated as religion. It's how, like, you would distinguish, for example, the Muslims from Christians in the state, right? So they would be different on the basis of their millah. Then it also would be different on the basis of way of their deen too, and indeed on the basis of their sharia, on the basis of the laws governing them too. At least the way that Al-Farabi is going to characterize this is that all of these concepts are sort of one and the same. So that, yeah, at the very least, it might be overly simplistic to say that Islam isn't a religion, but it is the case that at least that it's a far more expansive notion of religion than is popular in the Western world, again, especially dominated by sort of a Protestantism, in effect, where you sort of have religion be one part of life rather than the entirety of life or the entirety of the organization of the religious community. But indeed, outside of Protestant Europe, basically, throughout the rest of human history and the rest of the world, what we call religion really is the entire organizing structure of the way of life. It's not one special sort of part of that way of life. So, yeah, the precise word that we're going to translate that is being translated as religion in Al-Farabi, the word is mila. It's not the deen word, but Farabi very explicitly says that mila and deen are basically equivalent, as is sharia. So that all of these words are basically one and the same. So I hope that's helpful. Good. Any other sort of initial thoughts or questions or comments or anything? Or should we just dive into the fun stuff? I mean, he's so clear in a sense that I'm almost just going to go like step by step through his argument, just because it's so straightforward, almost. So that's mostly my plan, is just to go step by step through it. Any initial thoughts or anything before we get started with it? All right, then let's just briefly review what we talked about last class. So we just talked about last time pagan, Jewish, and Christian thought, at least incorporating sort of this Platonic philosophy. So he's talked about the way in which Plato's concept of the forms, these are sort of intelligible structures that determine what things are, right? These become ideas in the mind of God, right? So in a sense, we no longer really going to talk about forms, we're going to talk about the mind of God. It sort of comes to the same thing. Meanwhile, Plotinus is one, right, becomes this sort of transcendent, unknowable God, right? So what does transcendent mean? It means very explicitly in this context, just beyond, right? The one is beyond intelligibility and being, and so it transcends them. So insofar as we know this God directly, for example, in Jewish thought through Moses and through the report of Moses, and Christian thought through the direct sayings of Christ, right? We do so as a result of direct divine revelation on the one hand, right? So when God comes down and speaks to us, either himself or through the form of an angel, or we do it by sort of mystical practices of attaining divinification, and these were the practices that were heavily involved in the sort of monastic ways of life that opened up the sort of faster speeds of religious practice, the people who would take vows, right? And so these people would indeed engage in various kinds of divine practices, and Dionysus, he was talking about this in terms of kind of negative philosophy, emptying yourself of everything so that you can become full of God, and then you can attain a kind of mystical union with the Godhead. On the other hand, there's also positive theology. This is where we're talking about God insofar as we know the works of God and the structure of creation, so it's Plato's form stuff. There, we're gaining some insight, at least, into God by understanding the mind or the activity of God, and this was sort of positive theology. Okay, in the Western world, the Catholic Western Roman Empire collapses. It falls apart right around the 5th century or so. It doesn't have one date, but it's a slow, steady, gradual descent to the extent that you end up with about 400 years of what gets called the Dark Ages, where there's basically no learning or anything in Western Europe, and philosophy is lost entirely, especially Greek philosophy is lost entirely. Little bits of Aristotle and a couple smidges of Plato, and then a little bit gets preserved for St. Augustine. But when Catholic medieval philosophy starts up around the 10th century, it's starting over from scratch pretty much. They don't have a lot of the older texts. This doesn't happen in the Eastern Orthodox Roman Empire. It doesn't really collapse in the same way. It doesn't collapse until the 14th century, so way later. And so Greek philosophy then gets preserved in the East. It then gets into the Arabic world through mercantile exchange between various Arabic sort of kingdoms and the Eastern Orthodox Empire. And then eventually some of the philosophy books start to come. Especially important was this book that's called the Liber Causus. It's super big in the Western in Catholic thought too. It's attributed to Aristotle. It's actually a writing of Proclus that just sort of got misattributed to him. And so a lot of these Islamic and Catholic thinkers later will describe themselves as Aristotelians, but their Aristotelian thought is heavily rooted in this sort of late Neoplatonic thought because they think this is a book from Aristotle. The first big of these Islamic, they get called philosophs. There's no word for philosopher in Arabic. There's no word that translates into it. So philosoph is just a transliteration of the Greek word philosopher into Arabic. The first of these big Islamic philosophs is a man named Al-Kindi, who sort of introduces it. Al-Farabi is the first big one, now that it's been introduced, the one who's going to sort of use this thought to articulate the structure of Islam. So all that's just a little bit of background and reminder of what we talked about last class. Again, before we go any further, just any questions, any thoughts, any issues with anything so far? All right. So let's just start. Right. I had you do two books. The first thing from Al-Farabi is called The Book of Religion. Right. This is a book intended for a popular audience. The other one was the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. And this is intended for a more restricted audience. It's what frequently gets called an esoteric teaching, a sort of a secret teaching. But with that in mind, so we're going to start with the Book of Religion just because it's the easiest. They're not really that different, actually. He doesn't, like, hide what he's after. He maybe softens the blow of religion's sort of subordination to philosophy. But he doesn't really hide it. It's right there in the Book of Religion, too. And then he just expands on it and makes it way more explicit and way harsher sounding, almost, in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. So we'll start with the Book of Religion as the sort of easier, and again, that's the book of that's the word Mila. You don't need to worry about that. That's the word here they're translating as religion. All right. So what is religion, according to him? Religion is prescribed opinions and actions commanded by a supreme ruler for the community to attain some particular purpose. All right, so let's boom right there. This is do this in. I want to see this in your last drafts. I want to see this clear of a definition. All right, so what do we got? We've got beliefs, opinions. We've got actions. We've got practices. So we have its beliefs and practices. They're prescribed. They're commanded by some individual, some supreme ruler. They're for a community, so religion is intrinsically communal. It's instructions for governing a community. And it has a purpose. There's a task that's trying to be oriented as a result of it. All right. So boom, right there we go, just to start with. What we need to now figure out is, what does he mean by opinions? What does he mean by actions? What's the supreme ruler? And what's the purpose? So basically we just have to unpack this sort of definition. But like I said, this is actually a really good model for your papers. He's so overwhelmingly clear about what he means and just unabashed about what he means. Like there's no like, oh, you know, I don't want to offend anyone, or, oh, you know, different people believe different things about religion. And no, there's like, here's what it is. Here's what it is when it's done well. Here's what it is when it's done poorly. He just lays it out boldly. And so now all we need to do is just sort of track along with his boldness and sort of just break down step by step what is this definition actually entail. So let's start with the sort of probably, I think, the most surprising thing, this idea that religion is intended to accomplish some particular task. I don't think we've really read anyone that's sort of stated that explicitly. And I also haven't really read it in any of your papers, that religion is intended to accomplish some particular task. So this maybe is a helpful place to start. What is the task of religion? The answer is going to be a little bit twofold. We're going to need to talk about religion in two senses. So on the one hand, there's what he's going to call virtuous religion. Basically, just mean good religion. Right? Religions that are working, or religions that are doing what they're supposed to do. We're also going to talk about vicious religions, or bad ones, bad ones. So we're going to sort of define the task that religion is supposed to accomplish first in terms of the virtuous religion, and then we'll sort of go backwards and sort of talk about how that looks in the context of vicious religion. One very important thing to note, he is not saying that there is only one virtuous religion. He doesn't say it in this popular work, and he's really explicit about it in The Attainment of Happiness. As far as he is concerned, there are many, at least potentially, virtuous religions, right? And indeed, it will vary a great deal by community to community what the right religion for that community is. So, again, Islamic theologian. I feel like that continually bears repeating that he is an Islamic theologian. All right. So, in virtuous religion, in the good religions, the goal or the task is for the community as a whole to attain real or true happiness. So this idea of religion being connected to a pursuit of happiness, that's not new. We've seen that before. But that the goal of religion is to cause the community as a whole to attain that real true happiness. Right? This isn't individual. Right? Religion's not just about me being happy, and indeed he's going to say even that philosophy is not just about me becoming happy. If I'm a religious practitioner who can't make others around me happy, I'm failing in some sense. I'm not doing my job properly. Right? And the goal is to make the community as a whole truly happy, really happy, to get it right, to get happiness correct. This presupposes, of course, that there's a right answer about what a human happiness looks like. And indeed, we'll make this explicit. Indeed, that is true. This is indeed something that human beings can learn and discover. Right? Vicious religions, so bad religions, they look like they have the same goal. Their goal is also to attain some kind of happiness, but it's not the real or the true happiness. So we're talking about rulers here too, right? The goal of the virtuous religion or virtuous ruler. Right? The goal of the vicious ruler is either to attain for himself or for the community. It could be either, depending on how vicious. So the goal is to attain what Al-Farabi calls counterfeit happiness. Things that we humans sometimes take to be real happiness, but really aren't. Things like pleasure, wealth, honor, or conquest. And again, it depends on how vicious am I. Let's say I'm the vicious ruler for a second. How bad I actually am will depend on precisely the way that I do this, right? Like, if I am just sort of mistaken, if I just gotten it wrong in some sense, maybe I think wealth is happiness. So my goal will be to try to make the entire community as wealthy as possible. But if I'm even more depraved than that, I might try to impoverish the community to make myself as rich as possible. Right? And so that's why we say this is either for himself or for the whole community, depending on how bad this bad ruler actually is. And again, sometimes the vicious ruler will do this openly. Sometimes he does it covertly. Right? So sometimes you'll have rulers who are pretending to be virtuous, to be seeking true happiness, when all they really want is a lot of concubines, or all they want is to conquer a lot of territory. All right, so it can either be done openly or covertly. Again, if it's done openly, the person probably thinks that it actually is real true happiness, so they're just getting it wrong in some sense. Okay, so let's just even pause there for a second. How are we doing just with this distinction between vicious and virtuous religion? Because it's a really important one. We're going to define the vicious religions in terms of the virtuous one. So the virtuous one is sort of the paradigm case. And then we will define the vicious forms on the basis of sort of how they fall short of being religion in the proper sense of the term. How are we doing? Is this clear so far? One thing to note, so I said, right, this claim that sort of like, what would secularism be on this model then? Secularism is a kind of vicious religion. Right? It's religion that precisely doesn't try to attain real or true happiness, but one that's just after things like wealth or pleasure. Right? Not so much honor and conquest; those are out in modern secularism. Those are thought to be bad. But indeed, what does the modern state aim to attain? It basically aims to attain wealth and pleasure for the citizens. And depending on how good or bad you think the Congress or the president or whatever is doing, right? They're either trying to make themselves wealthy or they're trying to make everyone wealthy. Right? So secularism would be a kind of vicious religion, an orientation where the community seeks happiness in the wrong ways. Right? In the ways that won't actually lead to real or true happiness. Right. So how are we doing? And again, of course, within this, right, because there's only one way to get it right, but there's lots of ways to get it wrong, right? There's all different, you can get more and more perversely vicious forms of secularism, right? You can get ones that are violently atheist that try to suppress all religion, all true religion in its entirety, right? They'd be even more vicious. You can have ones that are just sort of mildly vicious, or just sort of ignorant of true happiness, right? So you have a great deal of gradation of vicious religion, but indeed secularism, atheism, all of these things are religions on this view. And the same thing will be true in Al-Ghazali. That part's not going to be different in Al-Ghazali's view either. All right. Ready to move on? Okay. That's erasing stuff. Sorry about that. Now he says, and this is a more popular work, so he says this, he doesn't say this in the Attainment of Happiness, at least not in the normal way, or in the Philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. He adds that virtuous religion will be connected to divine revelation in some sense. All right, but okay, so you might think you know what this means, but yeah, don't assume you know what this means yet. This actually doesn't mean what you would have thought it meant. Okay, what does he mean here? He means that the virtuous ruler has to actually possess a great deal of knowledge. In order to found or propagate a virtuous religion. At the minimum, he has to know what happiness really is. At a minimum, and probably a great deal more than that. But that's the bare minimum that is needed to be known, and that's not easy to know. Al-Farabi thinks this is indeed quite difficult. It will require some kind of divine revelation. So what do I mean by divine revelation? He says divine revelation can mean one of two things. One, divine revelation can mean God directly speaking to someone. As God did when he spoke through Muhammad. Or, and then here's why this should catch us off guard, or divine revelation can mean reasoning using a divine faculty. Okay. He doesn't say that, he doesn't go into more detail what he means by this divinely gifted faculty here. So let me spoil it for you. He means reason. That's what he means. Then he's talking about this divinely gifted faculty. He means reason. Right? He means the capacity to rationally investigate the world, i.e. the practice of philosophy. And by the way, he never actually explicitly says that God ever actually directly spoke to Muhammad. I don't necessarily mean that he doesn't believe in it. I mean, he might well think, yeah, that can happen too. But his stance certainly is that Muhammad was a philosopher king. That Muhammad is a preeminently gifted philosopher. That is certainly his sense. And so at the minimum, Muhammad also possessed this divinely gifted this faculty, this capacity of rationality, this capacity of rationally investigating. And again, this should make sense to us, perhaps be surprising, to be clear. I'm not saying it's not surprising, but this should make some degree of sense if we remember the sort of Neoplatonic framework that Al-Farabi is working from, right? Like, what is it to understand something? It is when your mind coheres with the divine mind. Right? There's only one mind. There's the structure of reality, and when your mind is in conformity with that structure, you understand something. And indeed, Plato himself says this, even not even going to go to Plotinus for this. Plato himself says you've become kind of divine in a sense, right? because your activity isn't a merely human activity, it's a divine activity. Now, you're actually grasping and understanding the intelligible structures. You've sort of gone beyond the human in your course of your being human. All right. So again, let's just pause. I want to pause for a second. How we doing with divine revelation? Good. The first one should seem normal to you. That second account should, again, have been surprising. My guess is you were not expecting that reason is itself divine revelation. All right. So what things is this ruler going to have to prescribe to people, right? We said that the true ruler, the sort of supreme ruler, right, commands various things. What does the true ruler command? The true ruler commands various opinions and actions. Right? So let's do both. What kinds of opinions does religion require? Right? This is not just virtuous religion. Right? Vicious religions will also command opinions and actions too. So everything that we're going to say here, right now anyway, at least at first, we're just describing religions in general, not just the virtuous ones. We're also describing the vicious ones too are going to make proclamations about these things. So by opinions, okay, there's two different kinds of opinions that religion tells us to hold. Some are theoretical. Right. So what are some examples here? Accounts of God. For example, if I'm a vicious religion and I say God doesn't exist, that is indeed a theoretical belief, commanded by that religion. Right? Things like ranks of supernatural beings, if there are other supernatural beings besides God, how the world was created, how is the world and nature structured. Right. This in philosophy is called metaphysics, this last one. Right. But also, Al-Farabi says things that besides metaphysics are included. We might also want to know things about the natures of things within the world. So physics. We might want to know about human beings, which is ethics and politics. And lastly, things that have to do with the generation, death, and afterlife of living things. So religions are going to prescribe various sorts of beliefs about all of these theoretical topics. Now, again, what specific beliefs are they going to describe? Well, that could vary enormously, right? At least all virtuous beings are going to say that there is such a thing as God. But indeed, the vicious ones, some of them might have gods, but some of the vicious ones might not have gods. Right? Every religion is going to give us an account of the creation of the world, but some of those accounts are going to be vicious and some are going to be virtuous. Some are going to be conducive to human happiness and some aren't. Similarly, straight on down the line with anything, right? These are all kinds of theoretical beliefs that religions will command. There are also, however, practical beliefs that religions command too. Right? These are things like who are good rulers, good princes, good lawgivers, right? Who are prophets and sages. Conversely, who are vicious rulers, vicious lawgivers, who are fools, and the ignorant. So beliefs about what makes, so to speak, a good or bad member of the political community. That's what we're sort of talking here. And indeed, again, every religion is going to prescribe such things, perhaps in very different ways, though, right? I mean, the good ruler in a virtuous state is going to be very different from who the good ruler that's proposed in a bad state, right? I mean, who is the tyrant going to say is a good ruler? Well, the tyrant's going to say that the tyrant is a good ruler, right? Conversely, if you're not living in a tyranny, what will that state say is the good ruler? Anyone but the tyrant, or at the minimum, the tyrant is the worst of all possible rulers, right? So again, these two there will need to be accounts of all of these things within the religion, right? But there are many different possible accounts that can be given of these things. Right? The way you could sort of put this last one, these sort of practical beliefs, right? Their goal of them, Al-Farabi says, is so that the average citizen understands or has some sense of why the city is organized in the way that it is. We could call it kind of a founding myth. Do we have these in the American context? Sure we do. You all know the story of the founding of America. Now, the story you know about the founding of America probably isn't especially true, right? It's sort of a myth, right? But that doesn't even matter. That's beside the point, right? You all have this myth about George Washington chopping down the apple tree, right? And, you know, Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, right? There are these founding political myths that you use to interpret what America should look like and why it looks the way that it does. Whether they're true or not, that's almost sort of irrelevant, right? We too have these same founding myths. This is not, you know, secularism has its own founding myths. Adam Smith's invisible hand, while it might well be a scientific account of economics, the average person doesn't understand any of that. The average person uses the invisible hand as a founding myth to understand the structure of the political community. Right, Nick, go ahead.
Sorry, there we go. Does this kind of, I mean, even if it works in the American context, does this kind of assume some degree of combination of church and state? Because I know, especially if it's coming from the Islamic ideology, I know with like Saudi Arabia, there is this combination, there is this Quranic kind of combination between the church and state. Does this work as much in states such as ours? I mean, sure, to some degree with the founding myth, but does it even work today with our separation?
Sure it does, because part of our founding myth is that, you know, the Puritans fled England to be free from the persecution that the state religion of England had. So the Puritans resolved, I mean, I'm making all this up, right? But it's not like a lie in a certain sense, right? But it is sort of the founding myth, right? Like, so that when they came here, this was a land where people could worship as they see fit and no one would tell people how to worship. That itself, though, is a founding myth, right? Like, that is a myth where you establish why our political community separates church and state.
So it even works in a sense of non-religion, this kind of myth of community leaders establishing that myth and that narrative.
Only from Al-Farabi's perspective, he would just characterize it a little differently. He would characterize it as it would work even in places where people are so fundamentally confused they don't know what religion is.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Right, where they have such a vicious religion that they've now distinguished religion from political activity. Right? But, yes, it still even works in that context. It just works in that context as sort of like a degraded, vicious religion. Right? It's one that's even less capable of attaining happiness, right, for the people. And indeed, note, if you actually read the Founding Fathers, they're well aware of this. If you read the Federalist Papers and you read like the notes that like Franklin and like Jefferson wrote, they're well aware that if there is no state religion, what that's going to mean in the United States is that most people will go to hell because they will believe nonsense. And so the state religion is in the United States then is, yeah, believe whatever nonsense you want. It's not just believe, it's your God-given right to believe whatever nonsense you want. With the understanding then that most people will indeed believe horribly awful things and ruin themselves in a fundamental way. The founding fathers just thought that was worthwhile. They just thought the alternative was worse, which maybe is true. I don't mean to say whether or not they're right or wrong about that, right? But from Al-Farabi's perspective, at least, that was the wrong choice. From Al-Farabi's, that is the most vicious form of religion possible, the religion that doesn't do anything to help you attain happiness, right? And by religion, we mean religion/state structure, right? The organization of society. So does that help?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
All right, awesome, good. All right, Tim, go ahead.
My initial question, but just to Nick's comment, there's, by Farabi's definition, you could consider like Americanism as defined as like our distinct brand of nationalism. You could call that a religion under his definition.
You should.
And then,
yeah.
On top of that, there are religious sociologists who I've read and studied that argue that Americanism is a civil religion. One of them even bounced it off of Confucianism to prove his point.
Yep, absolutely.
We have rituals, we have symbols, we have the whole deal, like almost kind of like you look at the Supreme Court and the Capitol building, they're all big like cathedrals or temples.
Yep.
So
yep. You look at our money, and our money is littered with all kinds of bizarre iconography. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and indeed, a lot of postmodern thinkers, sort of ironically, ones you would not expect to be coming from an Islamic perspective, they'll actually say very similar things. A lot of postmodern thinkers will say very similar things about religion as well. It's sort of religion, all religion just is civic religion. And so then Americanism is a religion, right? It's the structure of American civic life. Yeah. But you said you had another question too, or another comment too, right?
You'd already answered that. So I'm good.
Okay, awesome. Good. Any other sort of thoughts, comments, just based on this sort of initial move? And again, the key thing to remember here is we're defining all religion in terms of virtuous religion, and then the vicious religions are sort of defined as degradations of the virtuous religion. That's sort of be a helpful way maybe of sort of thinking about how this is sort of operating. Okay, so what about the actions then? So we've talked about the opinions. Now let's talk about the actions. What actions does it command? All right, religion commands, in effect, various kinds of actions, right? Just various things people have to do. So just some examples of these, right? Speeches praising various sorts of things. For example, possibly gods. Etc. Whatever. Speeches just praising certain things. There's going to be norms regulating our behavior. And then various also then we have sort of punishments for wrong behavior. And again, all of this is going to vary wildly. I mean, there's a real close connection between these actions and sort of the practical beliefs. They sort of go hand in hand, right? Like, what things are we going to praise? Well, it depends on who we say the good rulers are, the good princes, the good citizens. What things are we going to punish? Well, it depends on who we say are the bad citizens, the bad lawgivers, right? The fools, right? What behaviors are we going to promote? Well, it depends on what we think is good or bad, right? So the specifics of these various kinds of actions are going to vary a great deal on the basis of the sort of practical beliefs that we have. The way Al-Farabi is imagining this, the practical beliefs sort of come first, and then the practical beliefs sort of determine actions. So he's got sort of a top-down sort of model where you sort of start with the more theoretical, then you go to the practical, and then you end with action as sort of the last level of this sort of ascent. And so as a result of these various facets of the things that religion commands, there's various things that we could just define as synonymously. Religion is the same thing as the creed of a people, and it's the same thing as the laws governing the people. And those are all the same thing as the traditions that the people follow. These are all just fundamentally synonymous concepts. So again, just want to pause for a second, make sure everyone's still good. So any sort of question about those equivalences? I think that it sort of follows pretty readily from what we've been saying so far. But does anyone have any sort of questions or issues with it? All right, good. Then now let us turn to talking about the specific things that happen within a virtuous religion with regard to these various opinions and actions. In virtuous religion, so now we're shifting. Before we were talking about what you might say in any religion, but in virtuous religion, the opinions and actions that the ruler commands are functionally identical, or sort of practically speaking identical, to what philosophy says should be believed and commanded. There is a difference, and we're going to need to talk about what the difference is. But in practical terms, at least, they're identical. So what we should believe, theoretical philosophy. What we should do, practical philosophy. These should overlap. They should perfectly overlap in virtuous religion. Why is this the case? It's because philosophy, what it does, is discovers the general forms of human happiness. And other forms too, not right. Other sort of related forms about various kinds of animals, forms about how the cosmos as a whole, yada, yada, yada. Forms about God, right? So philosophy discovers the general forms of human happiness, and it knows these things. Right? Religion, its task is to apply these general forms, to put them into practice. And you should clarify, this is virtuous religion, I mean here. Business religion doesn't do this, but virtuous religion does this. Right? Philosophy supplies the proof for what religions command that you should believe. And again, this is supposed to be one-to-one. There's not supposed to be any remainder. There shouldn't be anything that religion commands that can't be philosophically proven, and there shouldn't be anything philosophically provable that the religion doesn't, in some minimal sense, command. And so, as a result, Teacher straightforwardly says, and this is a popular writing. It's astounding that he says this in a popular writing. Philosophy is therefore, religion is therefore subordinate to philosophy. And this is in principle. It might not be subordinate in fact, right? You might have a vicious religion, right? But in principle, at least, the virtuous religion should be subordinate to philosophy. Right? It is a practical or applied philosophy. And so it makes philosophical truth, which most people can't understand, either because they just can't, or because they're just too busy with other things. So religion takes this philosophical truth and makes it understandable and applicable in the lives of the average person. philosophy for the people. And again, this is a popular writing, so he doesn't like make it sound too brutal. But once we turn to the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, he's gonna make it sound brutal once we get to it. How are we doing just with this? So this is that's sort of the end of our popular writing. Did anyone have any other sort of thoughts, questions, comments just about what he thinks religion is in the most basic sense? All right, good. Let's keep it going now. Let's turn to the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. We're not going to go step by step through this one. This is quite a bit more complicated. This is a teaching that's sort of reserved for you. If you want to actually read this in great depth, we'll spend like a week on it in medieval philosophy, because I love this. I love this Islamic stuff. We spend a long time on the Islamic stuff in medieval because it's so different and interesting. But we'll just give a very broad overview of what he says in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle today. So in this writing, right, he begins, or at least he began the part I asked you to read today, by distinguishing the elect from the vulgar. The elect are those who go beyond merely accepting common opinions. So, for example, let's just make this really concrete, because I think we need to make this really concrete to see what's actually happening here. What would be an example of someone who just goes along with common opinion? The person who's like, oh yeah, I'm going to go to college and then get a pretty good degree, try really hard, get really good grades, and then when I'm done, I'm going to get a job because that's what people do. That is someone who is not elect on Al-Farabi's account, because the reason you believe all of those things is just because they're in the air of your culture, right? It's sort of these sort of cultural traditions and cultural norms. What do you do if you were good as a high school student? You go to college and then get a job. That's just what you do. So if you're just doing what it is that you do, you're not one of the elect. The elect don't do that. The elect are sort of unsatisfied with these common opinions. You would be one of the vulgar. And there's degrees of election, right? The most elect is the person who most of all does not accept any opinion, anything that is mere opinion. Right? Who doesn't just accept the opinion, but who wants to know even why it is that the opinion's true. This doesn't mean actually you have to reject the opinion. You want to know why it's true, though. You ask this sort of why question. Right? Why is it true? Is it true in all respects? Right. The person who is most elect is the person who is most qualified to be the statesman. And why is this? It's because the person who is the most elect is the one who's going to be prescribing commonly available opinions to others. And if all he's doing is just merely blindly repeating things that he's heard elsewhere, right, he's not actually going to be doing his job properly. His job is to determine what those commonly held opinions actually are. So the person who is most elect is the true statesman. But we can go on. But the most elect is also the one who is the most philosophical. Because philosophy, and he needs to define it in the work because this is a new word. This isn't a word that previously had existed in Arabic, right? Philosophy is the highest, the search for the highest wisdom. That would be the one who is least of all just accepting commonly held opinions. So what does that mean? It means that the statesman is the same as the philosopher. The true philosopher is the one who knows the most important things, and that you be able to implement the most important things for the betterment of the entire community. And what level of community are we talking about? Well, it could be any level, right? Maybe I'm just doing it in my family. Maybe I would be doing it in my city. Maybe I would be doing that in my nation. Or maybe, because in the Islamic world, you sort of get the first sort of almost like multinational empires almost in a certain weird sense. Maybe I would be doing it in nations of nations, right? Through the caliphates, as the head of the caliphate. So to be the true statesman is to be the philosopher. Right? They are the same task, the same activity. And indeed, he really means this. He says unambiguously, if you call yourself a philosopher and could not rule your city, you are a liar. Right? You are a counterfeit philosopher, a fake philosopher. You will harm everyone around you if you do not really possess this power. Right? What he has in mind here is clearly Plato's philosopher kings. Right? That's clearly the image here. That the human community will never be happy if it is not, unless it is ruled by those who actually know. Now, he also says that it's not, it's not beholden to the philosopher to beg communities to let him rule, right? I mean, the philosopher probably has better things to do than rule, in a certain sense, right? But at the very least, the philosopher would be able to rule if the opportunity showed itself, if the opportunity emerged, right? So it's not merely an abstract theoretical venture to be a philosopher. It is to be able to use all that knowledge practically for the advancement of human happiness. How are we doing? Good so far? Right. But how is the philosopher going to do this then? If the philosopher somehow needs to use this philosophy for the betterment of all, how can the philosopher do this? Well, the answer is the true philosopher will do this through education. Through educating the citizens. And there are indeed various kinds of education, various ways of educating people. So the best kind of education is when you imprint in the soul the truth. Right? So you make people virtuous. And you make them wise, right? You imprint in the soul truth about behavior and truth about theoretical matters. That's making people wise. Okay. The only problem is that this is not going to work for the overwhelming majority of the human race. Most people just aren't actually capable of doing what Al-Farabi thinks of as philosophy. And if you're suspicious of him on this point, if you don't think he's right about this, here would be my argument. If you try to make it so that everyone has to become real philosophers, do you know what you get? You get flat earthers and anti-vaxxers. That's what you get. You get people trying to discover the truth for themselves who are not capable of doing so. Right? For whatever reason. And yeah, there's all kinds of reasons you could not be capable of doing it. But for whatever reason, people who are not capable of trying to discover the truth, trying to discover it. And what you'll get is nonsense. Right? That's what you will get. And again, the American founding fathers were not ignorant of that danger. Right? They were setting up a system in which a great deal of nonsense was going to be produced. Okay, so we can't do that. The true philosopher, this isn't going to actually lead to happiness, Al-Farabi thinks. It'll actually harm the community because it'll make people who aren't suited for this kind of inquiry have to engage within it. And that's just really dangerous. Okay, so what are other kinds of education? Well, there's a second best form of education where what you effectively focus on is you try to persuade people with images and stories to believe and behave in correct ways. So how many of you have really seriously thought about why incest is bad? Like done the proofs or whatever, like maybe a couple, like one person, I see one hand going up, but like for the most part, right, you're just like, yeah, incest is bad. And you've just been sort of loosely persuaded of that, right? You didn't investigate. Now, in principle, you could investigate, right? There's nothing stopping you from investigating. But you've been persuaded about it in such a way that you didn't actually have to engage in the kind of investigation that's necessary to acquire philosophical truth. This second kind of education is fundamentally imagistic. So in this kind of education, you end up with a lot of people believing true things and doing the right thing, but they don't know why the things that they're doing or believing are actually true, or why they're the right things to do. This is really valuable. This is going to make really good work, and this will work for most citizens. So the philosopher will predominantly employ this second form. There will be some, I'll just mention this as an aside, there will be some who this won't work on either. Then you'll have to engage in corrective education. Anyone have a sense of what I mean by this? Yeah, punishment. Right, for people who can't even be persuaded, I can for others, I'll employ punishment so they at least refrain from doing bad things, even if I can't get them to actually believe and do true things. I can at least make them be scared of doing bad things, and that's a kind of education of its own. All right. But okay, what method should the philosopher use to do this sort of second kind of teaching? How do I do it? How will the philosopher do it? The philosopher will do it by inventing a religion. Or if one already exists, right? Like, Al-Farabi doesn't think anyone's going to come up with a better religion, at least for the Arabs, than Islam. So then I'm not going to try to, and reinvent the wheel. Muhammad did a great job with Islam. So then he's about, Al-Farabi's writing about the 3 centuries into the existence of Islam. Right. At this point, like Al-Farabi, as someone who's involved in statesmanship, I'm just going to promote and propagate Islam further. I'm not going to invent a new one. Right? I will invent this religion. The religion will have lots of stories, rules, myths, punishments, all the stuff we were just talking about earlier in the Book of Religion, right? And these will be images of the truth. They're not the truth themselves, but also they're not falsehoods either, right? They are sort of true in the way that a story can be true, in the way that Aesop's fables are true, right? In a way that they can sort of like get us to have the right sort of like thoughts, beliefs, feelings at the end. I mean, I always joke when I'm teaching medieval philosophy, the way this is at play in modern American culture, my guess is the way that you all see the world is more than anything based on what Disney movies you watched when you were 5. That those movies probably played such an overwhelming sense in how you sort of like just viscerally feel the world should look for you, right? And not just Disney movies, not just other things. That's for me, it's Star Trek: The Next Generation. I watched Star Trek: The Next Generation when I was really young. Jean-Luc Picard is my hero, right? I can tell that almost matters more than all the philosophy I've done since, right? In terms of at least shaping my visceral sense of what the world should look like. Right? What matters is making sure that the stories that I'm listening to are the right stories then. Because these stories are therefore incredibly powerful. If someone had read Plato to me when I was 5, that wouldn't have done very much, right? But if someone reads, an Aesop's fable to me, that will actually do something. What matters is that these be the right stories. And this is what we mean by virtuous religion. Virtuous religion is the religion that actually instills within people the correct virtues and beliefs about what matters in life, that orients them properly so that they'll go about living their life in the right way, in the philosophically correct way, in the way that philosophy sort of says will make people as happy as possible. And so what we end up with here is the shocking equation at the end. So the philosopher is the true statesman, is the imam, the religious teacher. The true version of all of these is one and the same person. At least he adds, at least if human beings are ever to be happy. Because otherwise, you're going to watch the wrong Disney movie, or there'll be something dangerous in the Disney movie, and that will stick with you forever and hinder your ability to be happy. Right? Because you'll always have an image of true love that's a bad image of true love, and that will always hinder all of your relationships. Or because you read Ayn Rand at an impressionable age, and you will always misunderstand the appropriate place for economic activity in a happy human life. And again, a few people will do the philosophy anyway, but that's going to be rare. That's not going to be most people. The religion, quite literally, is dumbed down philosophy, but not dumbed down in the sense, like people always read this from this sort of American context as if it's a kind of propaganda. And I guess like it kind of is, but it's not false though. Like no untruth is being told within virtuous religion. Everything virtuous religion says is almost the right way of putting it is true enough. Right? Like it's true enough. It gets at everything that's right. It's just you wouldn't be able to understand me if I told you what was actually true. So I'm going to tell it to you in this true-ish way so that you can go along with it. The Buddha, by the way, says the exact same thing. The Buddha says constantly, it's like, I could actually answer your question, but you wouldn't understand my answer, so I'm going to tell you a story. And you'll be able to understand my story and do better than you otherwise would. Tim, go ahead.
So we shouldn't then interpret this to be like an endorsement of like the noble lie, or I took it as he was endorsing sophistry.
Yeah, this is more. If it is going to be sophistry, it's what's going to be. Then the later Neoplatonists are going to call philosophical sophistry. Sophistry employed by the philosopher to make people better. It's not the noble lie in the sense of being a falsehood, and that would be a difference between what he's saying in Plato. Plato does characterize, though even in Plato it's super weird because he says it is a noble lie, but he doesn't say that it's false either. Like it's like, again, it's sort of like true enough in a weird sense. But yeah, even more, I think, than the way Plato puts it in the Republic, at least, he is emphasizing that like the religion is true. The religion is right. It's just true in the mode of that a story is true rather than in the way that a philosophical proof is true. So does that work? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's totally what. Yeah, you got it. Nailed it.
And someone in the chat is asking me, what about sophistry? So sophistry is a term from ancient philosophy. The sophists were basically lawyers of the ancient world. Is the easiest way to think about it. It was basically people who were reputed to be able to sort of just like get people to go along with stuff, but not on the basis of good arguments. So people who could make sort of like bad arguments or tell sort of like stories to get people to like sort of cheer for them, get people to go along with stuff, but not actually make people smarter at the end of the day, right? Not make people actually philosophers. So Plato is deeply concerned about sophistry because his teacher, Socrates, was constantly accused of being a sophist. And so Plato's like, no, Socrates wasn't just getting people to go along with stuff. Socrates was making people better. So philosophy actually makes people understand things. Sophistry just gets people to go along with stuff. That's sort of the difference here. And religion is sophistical in a sense. Like the goal of religion is to get you to go along with it rather than to teach you what's true. But this is really important. If you want to actually know what's true, great, just become a philosopher. Right? This isn't exactly elitist in the normal sense of the term. I mean, it's very hierarchical, obviously. Right? There's very clear hierarchies in society on the basis of this. But it's super weird. Like, if you want to actually understand stuff, well, then just become a philosopher, right? But most people don't actually really want to understand stuff. So I'm not like keeping people from doing things they want to do. What do people want to do? They want to like make a lot of money, eat good food, right? Like I'm not stopping people from doing what they want to do. And I'm actually keeping them from having to do a bunch of stuff they don't want to do, like figure things out about the world that they're not qualified to figure out, right? And still having them have sort of true enough beliefs or good enough beliefs that they'll still make good rather than bad choices about the world. I mean, notice just how nonsensical the idea of church-state separation sounds like from this framework. Like, if you think Al-Farabi's framework is the right one, church-state separation is basically just saying, like, screw all of you, most of you are going to be miserable, sucks to be you. And indeed, that is the conclusion, right? His conclusion is these three will have to be the same thing if human beings are ever actually going to be happy. If the human community is ever really going to be happy, these are going to have to be the same thing, right? Because they'll have to begin from knowledge and then end in action. Because you don't just, if you do what we do normally, where you just end with like begin with random nonsense, it's going to be random nonsense all the way down. You have to have people who actually know the truth, figuring out everything, if we're ever really going to be happy as a community. Okay? And so he concludes, and then we'll end here for today. So therefore, philosophy is prior to religion. Okay? In multiple senses, it's more godlike. It's more certain. It's more true. And it's, he says, lastly, prior in time. At least in the case of virtuous religion. At least in the case of virtuous religion, the philosophy comes first. All right, so we actually got through everything today, which is awesome. I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to do all of it. So my hope is at the very least, you're like, this is amazingly bizarre. I hope at the very least, you're just like, this is such a cool, different way of interpreting the world. And it really is. So he's not, so let me say a few last little words and I'll let you all go. So certainly Al-Farabi is not let us say, an orthodox Islamic thinker. The part that's the part that's really not orthodox, though, is going to be this last part. This last thing is the thing that makes him not orthodox. Al-Ghazali, who we're going to read next, who is almost the archetypical orthodox Islamic thinker. We're going to read his book called just the introduction of it, called The Revival of the Religious Sciences. I'll talk a little bit about what the book in general is next time. It's basically, outside of the Quran, to this day, the most widely read book in the Islamic world. I'm told. I don't know this firsthand. I'm told secondhand. So this is an incredibly important book about how to live an Islamic life. How to live a properly religious, quote-unquote, life. He's going to not have a lot of the philosophy stuff, but otherwise it's going to look quite similar to a lot of the basic sort of ideas behind this framework. So that's what we'll do next time. You might need 2 days on it, and that's fine if we do. Otherwise, we'll try to get it done on Thursday and see how we do. Thank you all very much. I hope at the very least you found this interestingly bizarre, if nothing else. Yeah, I'll see you on Thursday, and we'll go from there. Have a good one.
Thank you.